Hey, Pax Makers, this is Dorcas Cheng-Tozun, Pax's editorial director. We are currently in a story arc on contemplative activism, a way of living in which we prioritize both doing and being, both engaging and remaining grounded, and in which we remain closely connected to other people, to God, and to our own souls. In this myth path point, we're looking at a belief held by many people who love justice and shalom and who feel called to give themselves toward this work. The belief, which is actually a myth that can cause extensive harm to ourselves and others, is this: God needs us to act for the good of the world and not sit still. It is my privilege today to speak with Nikole Lim, who's going to walk us through her story and unpack how this myth has played out in her own life. And Nikole is fabulous, and so I hope that you will learn about her work and follow her online. She's an artist, an activist, a writer, a speaker, and the founder and international director of Freely in Hope, a nonprofit that works primarily in Kenya and Zambia to equip survivors and advocates to lead in ending the cycle of sexual violence. Nikole is a good friend of the Pax family, as she has so much wisdom and experience to share with us. Nikole, thank you for being here. I'm so glad to see you today.
Yes, I'm so honored to be here again. Y'all are my favorite.
Well, we love you too. The love is mutual. So I wanted to start with a little bit of background about you to give everybody some context. So can you tell us how you first became engaged with social justice work and the kind of work you do and how long you've been doing it?
Yeah, so my work actually began as an international documentary storyteller. I was doing photography and video for international agencies all around the world for about a decade. And that work brought me in and out of homes, in and out of villages, in and out of communities that were completely foreign to me. And after a whole decade of doing that work, I eventually felt that the in and out was not sustainable, not
Mm,
consistent. I
yeah.
was doing this beautiful like marketing packaging work for these larger agencies, not actually knowing if the agency was doing due diligence for the people that I was serving. I was putting cameras in people's faces, expecting them to
Mm,
tell me their deepest, darkest secrets. And then I would,
yeah.
again, package that into this beautiful 3-minute presentation, give it back to the agency, and never see those people again. And so after
Mm,
many years of doing that, I just felt like eventually it became unethical for me in terms of storytelling practice. And after seeing and witnessing such disparity across the world, I felt like I needed to do something more beyond simply storytelling, but
yeah.
to actually partner in uplifting survivors of sexual violence and alleviating systems of injustice by creating new systems of equity and liberation. And
Mm.
that's how my work has evolved.
Yeah, yeah. That's incredible. And it is incredibly intense what you do. And so I imagine that at some point it has become overwhelming. And so has there been a time where you felt like you've sort of hit a breaking point where, things just got really, really hard? And why do you think that happened? What led you to that?
Yeah. So there's been many times I've reached breaking points. And I'll tell you I guess the crux of a
Mm,
breaking point that happened very early in my career. That is also the crux of my book, Liberation is Here, from which everything stems. So when I started Freely in Hope, I was 21 years old,
wow.
fresh out of
Yeah.
college.
So
Don't
yeah.
recommend. If y'all are 21 thinking about a nonprofit, call me first. Okay. I didn't know. I actually studied film
Yeah.
production in university, and so film was my pathway. But
Mm,
again, like I said, as I had been doing that for so long, I was keen to learn of other ways regarding systems of equity, of
sure.
justice, of healing, and of hope. And when I was confronted with survivors' stories face to face, that's when I realized there's a greater call to my vocation, again, beyond storytelling, but now into community development. And so that's how
Hmm.
Freely in Hope started. It wasn't
Sure.
my idea, it wasn't my intent. Survivors actually called me into this
Mm,
journey and into this vocation. And because I was so
yeah.
inspired by their vision for a better world, I decided to partner with them to create this organization. So 3 years into the work, the stories of sexual violence, the issues of injustice, the communal trauma, the global issues that we were facing was becoming so heavy for me that, again, not having tools or resources or understanding of how to sustain myself in this work, I began to overfunction. And I was working harder and longer. At the time too, I was mostly in the field. So I was traveling between Kenya and Zambia quite frequently. And I was hearing story after story of trauma upon trauma that was affecting the people that I loved the most, affecting the people that have, again, called me into this new vocation. There was a story of one of our very first survivors from Kenya, whose perpetrator was literally trying to steal her child and was chasing her from house to house as she moved all over the place. And we couldn't do anything with the justice system because he belonged to a certain sect of people that is known for their community violence. There was another case of another girl whom I had met 3 years prior when I first started the organization. And 3 years later, after building more trust with me, after, trying to gauge, right, if I was in it for the long haul or not, or be like all those other American organizations who come and go. After 3 years of building a relationship with her, she finally told me that throughout her years, since 8th grade, she had been prostituting to earn money for her school fees. And when my organization came along to provide the school fees, she was still prostituting because she had to pay the school fees for her nieces. And there's another incident where one of our scholars was walking from her house to the bathroom, the community bathroom in her village, and was assaulted and raped. And so the question of how can I say that I am leading a organization that exists to end sexual violence when I can't even hold safety for my own community of survivors that I am serving, that I am protecting, that I am supposed to be caring for. And so that question is what led me to overfunction, so that I would hustle and run between police stations, between counselors, between legal support advice, between the scholars' homes and their families, and trying to advocate and do all of these things for them. And in the process of trying to do all these things for them, I developed a cold. And that cold escalated into some unknown virus where I was completely debilitated.
Oh my goodness.
I could not eat. I could not sleep. I was throwing up water. I lost 15 pounds, and I was living in one of the villages in Lusaka without running water, without electricity. And it was the heat of the desert summer. So I'm sweating profusely, unable to drink liquids. And so I'm lying there sick in bed, and the children around me were like, they didn't know what to do. And the mom that I was living with, I was living in the community with one of the families. The mom was like, do you want to go to the hospital? I'm like, no, I'll be fine. And I continued to schedule meetings during that time.
Oh, wow. All right.
I continued to call all the legal advocates that I was working for with these on these cases. So eventually got to the point where I literally felt like I was gonna die. So I called my mom. Yeah, I don't know what time it was here, but it was very early in the morning. I'm like, Mom, don't be alarmed, but I'm sick. I'm in Zambia. I've been sick for, I think it was 2 weeks at that point. Sick straight for 2 weeks, can't drink water, losing weight, can't eat anything, sweating profusely, massive pounding headache. What do I do? And without skipping a beat, my mother says, you can either rest now or rest later. And I'm like, okay, time to go to the hospital. So I went to the clinic, long story short, but in these communal clinics, again, just the level of care wasn't there, and I wasn't able to advocate myself because I had, like, all of my functionalities were completely
Mm.
gone. Like I didn't have strength to even apply chapstick. I was completely dehydrated, right?
Wow.
Couldn't even apply chapstick, couldn't pack my bags, couldn't change my clothes, couldn't speak to the nurses to find out what was happening. Like that level of incompetence.
Yeah.
And so it was in that season that I was questioning my vocation.
Yeah, sure.
Questioning if God had really called me to this work. And I felt that I had failed in my leadership. If I could not prevent the violence of the world from happening to my community members, when that is my mission and my vocational call, then I felt like I had completely failed as a leader.
Yeah. It sounds like you took on the burden of the world, right? It was like all these people's lives and trauma that you were carrying, that you were trying to fix. And in the midst of it, it sounds like you sort of disappeared. You know, it was sort of just Nikole with everybody else's challenges and traumas. And yet there didn't seem to be that much Nikole, at least in terms of what I'm hearing in your story. But I'd love to hear from you, you know, through that whole experience, what did you learn about yourself and the activist life? What did you learn about God and faith, and how did you come out of that?
Yeah, so this is where the gift of contemplation really saved me. My board members really advocated for a sabbatical for me. I had not actually realized, even coming out of that, like when my physical health was well, I didn't know what had happened. I thought I just got sick.
Yeah.
So the story I'm telling is all, of course, in like retrospect, 10 years later. But I thought I just got sick, right? And it wasn't until I had started Sabbatical that my board members advocated for, and started in therapy for the first time. It's like, wow, I advocated for therapy for my community, never having experienced it myself.
Wow.
So that was a big, I think, practice of humility for me at the time, to practice what I preach and what I implement. So in therapy is when the therapist was like listening to my story, and she's like, you have PTSD. And I was like, but I didn't go through the trauma.
Yeah.
Right? I didn't understand secondary PTSD and vicarious trauma, right? And how even in community, a lot of the energy, right, passes between people and between souls and between hearts, and in care and love and compassion. So, in that whole season in therapy on sabbatical, interestingly, I went to Rwanda. This was in 2014, so it was after the 20th anniversary of genocide.
Yeah.
Being in Rwanda during that time was weird. I don't know why I decided to do it, but it was actually really helpful to see violence from, this sounds terrible, but it was important. Let me rephrase. It was important for me to witness and observe violence from a different perspective, so that I can learn about the healing and reconciliation that needed to happen as a result, and the systems of justice that needed to be in place to prevent that from ever happening again. And so hearing those stories of healing, of processing, of actually learning how to grieve, learning how to lament what had happened in genocide, and then learning new pathways from local leaders that were driving equity and justice and peace building forward. That's what gave me a sense of hope to reimagine something new. In the process of that as well, when I was still on sabbatical, actually, I went to Hawaii, where my aunt and uncle lives. And there was this incident that I also write about in my book, where I had just woken up to a phone call from one of the girls that had been assaulted during her time with us, and she was suicidal. And in that instance, it's like, you know, how do I respond when I'm all the way in Hawaii, you're all the way in another country? And I had to walk her through, you know, putting down her weapon and imagining something new for herself. And that incident was really interesting because the fact that she chose to walk away, to put her weapon down, to walk home, was a really important metaphor of ways that I could also choose to put my weapons down that I had put against myself and to walk toward my calling again.
Yeah.
That same scholar I was recalling, like, again, like when you're in a traumatic state, you get a lot of memory. A lot of the traumatic memory comes back and it manifests in the nightmares, and it manifests in your body, and it manifests in visions. So I was getting a lot of memories just like flooding my head, a lot of traumatic ones, but also a lot of healing ones. And one of them being where that same scholar who had actually attempted suicide before, so that wasn't her first attempt, and that's why I was on high alert when she had called me. But when she was first sexually assaulted at 14, she had a suicide attempt where she cut her wrist. And when she told me about her story, it was through the scar. So she first showed me the scar and said, this is a scar from attempting suicide after I was raped. And that's what kind of opened up the door to my work, was that story and that scar. And every, you know, time that I would visit her, she would show me the scar as a reminder of how scars are evidence that wounds do heal. And she'll like point to it and she'll be like, look, it's healing even more. Cause I would only visit like once a year, if that. So it's healing even more every time. And so that memory too would come back and remind me that wounds do heal. Scars are evidence that wounds do heal. That putting our weapons down, whether they be physical, whether they be emotional, whether they be psychological or verbal, mental, you know, what we say to ourselves, putting those weapons down and moving toward the call again, healing is possible. And so survivors actually brought me back to the vocation after I had thought that I was not worthy of it.
Well, thank you for sharing those incredible stories of, you know, yourself and the women that you work with. It really brings to mind the thought that regardless of your own experience, how you grew up, what you went through, those of us who choose to follow this kind of calling, who choose to engage in the work of justice, in activism, we are putting ourselves on the line. You know, there is some extent to which you cannot do this work without being wounded, without absorbing or experience some level of trauma. And so the idea that we can just do and keep doing and not pay attention to our souls and our bodies and our minds, even our own support networks, communities, families, that's a false idea, because it's just, it's not possible for us to keep carrying forward in this really important work. But if we just continue to let ourselves be wounded and wounded and wounded again, without any opportunity to heal and to rest and to recover. And so I'd love to hear, you know, Nikole, what does that rhythm kind of look like for you today with all that you've learned over the years, all that you've been through? Is there some way in which you do find yourself being able to balance the work and the call, you know, with these times of rest and recovery and healing? And what does that look like?
Yeah. Earlier you asked, what are some of the things that kind of led up to the burnout? So beyond the actual traumatic incident, there's also physiological, psychological keys that, or triggers that also lead to the burnout. And so for me, what I assessed in myself were three things. And these are the three things that I still notice in myself on a daily basis that I have to put in check with new practices. the first is control, the second is ego, and the third is shame. So in control, in that particular situation where I was hospitalized in Zambia, I was really trying to control and dictate all of the outcomes to promote health, safety, security for the community.
Yeah.
To prevent sexual violence, right?
Right.
And so the fact that it was happening under my leadership felt like complete loss of control.
Yeah.
And so trying to cling to control is what led me further into the overfunctioning, so I can control more and more and more instead of accepting.
Harder at that.
Yeah, instead of accepting what had happened and then actually responding with more compassion with the survivors. I was actually in the justice system more so than in care of the survivor at that period. And so the thing that I practice on the daily is meditation, contemplation. So during that time too is when I grew up in a very evangelical, space. And so I had a lot of value for words and scripture and more words, words to kind of explain and understand, right? A lot of comprehension, knowledge through words that was of high value in evangelicalism. In being completely sick and depleted, I did not have any words to even pray. And so this is where I had to learn a new method of prayer through contemplation, through grieving, through resting, through sitting, through crying even, to meditate and be with self and God in self. I think that was the biggest lesson of practicing the letting go in contemplation, because in contemplation, right, you're not formulating words and beautiful phrases and prose so that the God up there might hear you if you can just speak more loudly or eloquently. I don't think God works like that. And so learning that God might also see and hear and feel beyond words and to be with, commune with, I think is the contemplative posture that I've learned to practice and implement in my daily life. The second is ego. Yeah. So in leadership, there's a lot of ego that is constantly, we have to keep in check. And how we keep ego in check is through community. When we are surrounded by community of all levels, people that are above us, with us, not below us, but in service with, I'd rather say, I think that is hearing from feedback, the 360 feedback, hearing it from all levels is what can help to remove ego. And so in terms of like upper, right, I have aunties, I have uncles, I have board members that have called me out on my shit because I told them if I ever am leading in a way that is not in alignment with my intentions, as you know it, as you've heard me articulate it, call me out and remove me. Like that needs to be fixed before I enter back into public service. And they've listened to me. And so many a time they're like, look, and I think that was also part of the board advocating for my sabbatical, because they were like, you are unwell. You are unwell and unable to lead to your best capacity. And I had to listen to that. Peer community, obviously, other nonprofit leaders, other women of color who are leading new initiatives in their families and their communities that have never been done before, kind of understanding and inspiring each other forward. That's been such a gift. I have really close friends all around the world that are doing similar things, many of them being survivors as well. And so because they're from the survivor community, they can tell me if things are getting to my head. And most importantly, the community of survivors, like I said, it was in my complete being unable to advocate for myself when I was ill that survivors in my community, the girls that I was serving, they were the ones actually healing me in that process, inspiring me to continue the work and inspiring me to say that, even after all the traumas that they've experienced firsthand, if they can choose to wake up, go back to school, if they can choose to show up in court and state their story in the face of the perpetrator, if they can choose to put their weapons down and imagine hope for their future, who am I, right? I can also try. So community, surrounding yourselves with community that you trust, that will call you out on your shit, that will hold you to higher standard, tell you when you're wrong, especially me being non-survivor, non-Black, non-African, right? My perspective is going to be different. And that's why I need that accountability from Black African women survivors who can tell me if my advocacy efforts are in line. And lastly, shame. And so the shame piece, shame in honor cultures, right?
I know.
and let me tell you, I was telling you
before,
I know. I was telling you before I got on this call, like I'm in it right now. Like I'm talking about an incident 10 years ago, but I'm in it currently right now. And the shame piece is actually really strong for me right now. So this is good that I'm confessing and verbalizing. The shame of I did not do it according to my intentions. I messed up. I failed. I failed myself. I failed my community. Why didn't I have policies and procedures? Why didn't I have staff members in place? Why didn't all these things, right? And so even now, as I'm dealing with the current crisis, I'm asking myself those questions, shaming myself, asking like, what happened? You totally screwed it up again. And so again, that like negative self-talk, it's not helping anybody, certainly not helping me, but just digging me more into my shame. The counter to that is therapy and spiritual direction, both, I would say. Yeah, that is imperative. And I think that's why, you know, in leadership stance, we have to have all of these different holistic ways of communing with self and God and self. So the contemplation that's here, the community, right, on all spectrums and levels, and then therapy in private space to help you discern and to actually speak the life that you want to see within yourself, and to learn that practice verbally, psychologically, mentally, physiologically. All of that is important to undo shame so that you are not inadvertently shaming others around you.
Yes. Those are such good words, Nikole. So much wisdom, so many great practices that you recommend. My last question for you is just, you know, if you were to meet the 21-year-old, you know, you or another young person who is kind of just on the beginning of their journey of trying to figure out, you know, what their calling is, how they want to engage with social justice work, what advice would you give to them on how to find that balance, that groundedness, the courage and the hope that you're speaking about, to continue to do the work, but in a way that is sustainable and that doesn't cause harm to yourself or others?
Yeah, so you can only bring healing to the world in as much as you've brought healing to yourself. You can only bring freedom to the world, liberation to the world, justice for the world, in as much as you've experienced that within yourself as well. And so to embed those practices into daily active life, notice when control, ego, and shame rises. Notice how you respond to those inklings of control, ego, and shame, and build in practices for meditation, community, and therapy or spiritual direction. I do both, therapy and spiritual direction.
Yeah, the more the better.
All the things. Yes.
Right, all of the above.
I am telling you all of my secrets because we don't want to die. We don't want to die anymore. Yeah. So notice those things within you. And I think to really also hone in on that ego community piece. Hey guys, social media has ruined us.
Yeah.
And I'm checking myself a lot. I'm like, it's such an egocentric platform, and that's the point, right? Yes, it has a lot of value. Obviously, I'm not saying I'm like no social media at all. Of course, I utilize it, but how is social media, how is your ego being represented to the public that's not aligning with your private life?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I've had many incidences where the community members have called me out as well, being like, your friendship with that person, your partnership with that organization, the way that you're talking to me is not in alignment with how you position yourself publicly.
Yeah. That feedback is hard to hear, you know. I think it takes a while to kind of build up your humility muscle almost, you know, and your willingness to hear it and take it in and acknowledge that that person is coming from a place of love and care, even when it's a really painful truth that they're communicating.
And that's why the community is so important. Who is your community though? You know what I mean? And I'm not saying your social media followers, they don't give a shit.
Yeah.
Your actual community who knows you, your intentions, and can hold you accountable to that. Because like I said, on social media, you can present yourself any way you want.
Yeah.
Complete farce. And so who are you on your public life and your public life? I think a merging of that is imperative to authenticity, transparency, holistic healing, right? And leadership.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would never want my family to see me publicly and be like, right? I could never. And so I have to ensure that the ways in which I treat and work with and align with folks in my private life are also manifested in my public values. So that really falls in line with the community piece. And so that's what I highly, highly recommend. And so always listen to the voices of the folks that you serve, always.
Yeah. Well, that is a great word to end on, that we cannot do this alone. We should not do this alone. We absolutely need people around us who we trust, who can hold us accountable, who can nudge us toward being more authentic and whole versions of ourselves, so that the work that we do can also be healing to the people around us. So thank you so much, Nikole. I really appreciate you sharing your story, your wisdom, all the hard lessons that you've learned along the way. And I really hope that other folks who are listening are taking this in and thinking about, what does that look like in your life? Who is your community? What are the practices that help you stay connected to yourself, that help you ensure that you are healed and whole and moving toward healing and wholeness? And so I just want to thank you again, Nikole. Thank you, PAX family, for joining us, and grace and peace to all of you.